Hello out there. It's a little bit early, so I'm just going to set up, see if anybody comes by. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about just an overview of AP Lit for teachers, especially newer teachers. There are a few things that have changed in the last, over the summer, getting ready for the 2020 exam. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what the exam is, what the course is, and how you might put it together. Just, be a little bit of a thought partner and a sounding board for anyone who is figuring out this AP Lit thing as a teacher. And even as a student, I feel like it could be really kind of helpful to see into how and why teachers organize what they're organizing, and kind of an overview of the exam and what the exam is supposed to do for them and for you, for what the course is supposed to do. Because it's not always just an exam prep course. I think most teachers, especially literature teachers, don't want it to feel like that, although obviously the end objective is to get you ready for the exam. So before we begin, obviously, if you're not following Fiveable on all possible social media outlets, I don't know why not. And then because we're talking to teachers today, I wanted to throw in the Teach Fiveable because it is a little different than the Think Fiveable for teachers on Instagram. So get on there and become part of the teacher and the student community and see all those awesome memes and GIFs that go on and that you can absolutely relate to. I think the Teach Fiveable memes and GIFs are very teacher oriented, and they're like, yes, okay, right, I'm not alone in this world thinking this way. I just wanted to say, coming up soon. So today is Intro to AP Lit for Teachers. Tomorrow is What Lit Is with Laura Walton. And so that's going to be geared more towards students. That's going to be tomorrow, the 29th at 7 p.m. And then next week, she's going to do a literary device review also for students. That's going to be September 5th, also Thursday. So AP Lit is kind of Wednesday for teachers, Thursday for students. And so on Wednesday, I'm going to be talking about culturally relevant pedagogy and AP Lit, and kind of how those things go together, how you can, it's going to be a little bit of a continuation of today, thinking about how to put the books that matter. There's a whole kind of disrupt text movement going on. So we'll talk a little about that and what that might look like in your classroom, especially if you have a lot of flexibility in what you teach and how you teach it. So today I'm just going to talk about what AP Lit is and always has been, then talk a little bit about how it's changing, the course description for this year, this My Classroom feature that College Board has created that you can use, then looking briefly at the rubrics, because there will be another stream about rubrics, just an hour diving into rubrics, the new rubric and how that works and how you might shift your teaching to match the new rubric. And then we're going to talk about the units. We're going to talk about the units the College Board gives, and we're going to talk about how you might lay out your class if you're still thinking about it, and how you might create a scope and sequence in order to match the big ideas and enduring understandings that College Board has laid out. Talk a little bit about a vision and class structure. Those are all going to be kind of the same idea. So first of all, if you just drop in the chat a yes or no, did you take the AP Lit test when you were in high school, or if you were in high school, or you just say, I'm going to take it this year, or just to see who we have in the building. I did not take the AP Lit test. So when I started teaching it, it was a little new for me. Obviously, I feel like people get afraid of afraid of AP courses, but I don't think that they're all that different than any lit course that you would teach. If you're talking about analyzing and talking about writing, you're basically talking AP Lit. It's just, that next level. I always say that AP courses are, college courses with high school supports. So it's important to keep in mind who you're teaching, but if you haven't taken the test, it doesn't mean anything. I taught AP language actually with someone who had taken the AP language test and gotten a 5. So I said, you're the expert here, but just wondering if anybody has taken the test. So if you have, then you will know the basic setup of it. It's been the same for years and years now. So there are 4 pieces. We usually think about it being 2 big pieces, and that's multiple choice and free response. That's like any other AP exam. We've got 45% of the exam weight being multiple choice. And so that's a little different. Other exams have a different weight, but because it's a writing test also, I think that's why the free response questions weigh a little more than they do in other subjects that aren't necessarily language-based or reading and writing-based. So you'll get 55 questions on poem and prose passages. There used to be maybe a nonfiction, but that's not going to be true anymore. And then you have the 3 free response questions. You've got 1, 2, and 3. I just call them Q1, Q2, Q3. The only difference, and this is why it's in all caps, Q3, is because it used to be called the open question, and now it's called the literary argument, but it's still basically the same thing. You're going to get a concept. Students will get a concept, and they have to talk about how that contributes to meaning of work as a whole. So that's an acronym that I use in class, and it is basically the foundation of the entire course. But that free response 3, literary argument, the open question, no matter what year you're looking at it, it's going to ask in some way how it contributes to meaning of the work as a whole. So Q1 and Q2, poetry and prose, that's really the big difference between them. The students will get a passage and have to write about it. The big shift here is that because of the way that the new rubric is set up, they're going to have to make sure that they respond with a thesis that establishes a line of reasoning and then support that line of reasoning with evidence and commentary. So that's the overview of the exam. That's what it's going to look like. That's what it's looked like for years and will continue to do so. So now, though, one shift in the exam is that the responses have been a little extended. And so all of the sample free response questions and all of the free response questions from here on out will align with that rubric, and they'll have these 3 pieces. And so these are kind of super important because they're going to show up on every single prompt. And so you want to make sure that the students know that these are the 3 things that need to be done, regardless of the type of question, and that these are also in direct alignment with the rubric. And so they need to make sure that they've responded to the prompt with a thesis that presents an interpretation and may establish a line of reasoning. I'm going to say that may is except for your extremely sophisticated, mature writers, you're probably going to want to make that may pretty mandatory, that it presents an interpretation and establishes the line of reasoning. Then the students will have to select and use evidence to develop and support the line of reasoning and explain with the commentary and the evidence, the relationship between the evidence and the thesis. And so these things are on the rubric and they will line up with the rubric. And then there's one more about basically sophistication in writing. And so these are the pieces of the new rubric, and they're now on the free response prompt. And so if you have students memorize these, you're not going wrong. Like, these are the 3 things that they're really going to have to make sure that they do, and then they can kind of check them off actually as they write or as they proofread, and make sure that they've done everything that needs to be done. So these are the instructions, as it says here behind the bar. These are the instructions that are going to be on every prompt for every free response question, 1, 2, and 3. So I wanted to look at the course description really quickly. If you haven't seen the course description, there's a link in the call to action. There's an arrow there, and that'll go straight to the new course exam and description. You probably have seen it, but just if you want to kind of be looking through it as I'm talking, That makes total sense. Most of these ideas and basic concepts just came straight from that. And so really we're kind of walking through that and thinking about what it means to us in particular, specifically you and your classroom. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the blues are kind of the important parts. It focuses on reading, analyzing, and writing about imaginative literature. And that's a little important. I think most people know that Lang is nonfiction and lit is fiction, but or imaginative. But just to remember that those are they're reading, analyzing, and writing about it. And that they're going to engage in this critical analysis to deepen their understanding of the ways writers use language to provide both meaning and pleasure. And that really stuck out to me because I think a lot of times we really drill into kids the way that writers use language to provide meaning, right? But not necessarily how they use language to provide the pleasure. And I think we understand that, but it's something that we don't always kind of explicitly walk students through. And depending on how your school creates AP classes, you may have students who are really interested in literature and find pleasure in reading the great literature of all times. But you might have somebody who needs a little nudge, right? And so they don't always want to think about how the language is providing meaning, but also kind of guide them down that pleasure path also. I definitely thought when I started teaching that I would be creating, critical readers and basically English majors in every student that I touched. And that doesn't happen, but it does happen sometimes. Sometimes a student can get turned on in an AP literature class as opposed to taking an AP literature class because that switch has already been flipped. So they're going to consider how those work structure, style, and themes, right? How these things are put together, how this language creates those sorts of ideas, and then analyze and interpret literary works. So again, all of this is just the basics of an AP Lit class, just remembering kind of what the intention is of the course. So I thought that was something to think about and kind of helps you set your intention for your own personal class and figure out, what it is that you want your students to get. And I think it's really important to take a few moments. I'm going to talk about this a little later, but take a few moments to have your students kind of set an intention. What do they want to get? Obviously, they need to do these things that are in the course intention, in the exam description, but also just what do they want to get out of AP Lit? Because it might be an increased toolbox for analyzing, but it might be, to figure out how to enjoy literature or to figure out what to call these things that they notice or how literature applies to the world. Let them create their own vision for it, I think is an important thing to do. So just a question to think about, what kind of support would you like from College Board? I think something that's happening lately is that College Board is realizing that they've encouraged open access to AP courses, but they haven't necessarily supported teachers in figuring out how that changes the course. And so if you have 15 students who are just hungry for literary analysis, that's a very different experience than if you have students who say, yeah, sure, AP Lit, like I need some rigorous courses, and that looks good. I got a pretty good grade in my previous lit classes. So what they're trying to do is create more and more support for teachers, especially teachers who are teaching it alone, teaching it for the first time. And so they've tried to create some of these things, build in some supports for teachers. And so hopefully the supports that they have are the kind of supports that a newer teacher would need. So AP Classroom is the online component of the new supports. And so the AP Classroom has unit guides on it that we'll look at later, but it's, you can access them there as well as in the course exam and description. But also it's got personal progress checks. And so these are for students. At the end of each unit, there's a set personal progress check. There's a progress check that each student will take. They can take it, they can write offline, but they have to take the multiple choice online. But they're created to allow a teacher to keep a constant check on the growth and needs of their students. And so you would sign up, your students sign up, and this is something that your test coordinator should know about if they haven't already talked to you about it. And you would go to College Board if you don't already have, if you don't have a membership, a profile, like, log into College Board, do it. And I would really strongly suggest, if you're new or not new, that you join the AP Literature community, because I have gotten so many ideas from that community, just getting emails and being able to, especially if you are teaching the course by yourself in your school, or teaching with other people who haven't been teaching it for very long. It's a really useful resource, and so I would really look into that. Also, tomorrow at 8, there will be a Fiveable live stream using AP Classroom. And so this woman, Caroline, she, as far as I understand, was part of the pilot last year, and so she's knows kind of the ins and outs of it. And she doesn't teach a literature course, but some of the features are going to be the same regardless. And so it would, be useful to check that out and see what she says about the features and what is most useful. But regardless, there are question banks on AP Classroom, and you can keep this dashboard of your students' progress. And so it's going to be useful, especially if you are in a school where there's a lot of technology or devices for students. I had the fortunate experience of being in a classroom that was one-to-one. And so every student had a Chromebook that they could access. And so we could have, almost completely online class. They could follow along, they could take notes, whatever. And so if you are in that fortunate position, then this could be something that's really useful, because students would be able to log in, and you can use these progress checks online. You can use the question banks online. You can assign those sorts of assignments to them. So again, collegeboard.org/myap. If you don't already have an account, that's also where you would have to go for the syllabus audit. So College Board is, it's definitely a good source if you know what you're going there to look for. Like if you're looking for older questions, or you're looking for this AP Classroom. I think obviously the Fiveable AP Lit community is going to be a really strong resource. And so I would really suggest you stay up with that. But it's a larger, community, and teacher to teacher. So another thing that's changed this year is the rubric. And so if you have taken the test before, if you've taken a course before, if you've taught the course before, you're really, really, really familiar with that scoring guide, that 0 to 9. There are all sorts of things that teachers do with the 0 to 9. They have peer edits, and they have, they obviously, teachers use it to score kids and have them know. And I highlighted those things, to say, this is where you are and here, and this is where we're going. But now they're changing that to be a point-driven rubric that's more similar to the kinds of rubrics that we tend to use in our courses. And so it breaks it down into categories, and the students can earn points per category. And so that takes it out of the nebulous, abstract kind of atmosphere that I think most literature teachers like to live in, but it will probably be more useful for students as they're gaining their skills, as they're honing their skills. And so the 3 categories are thesis, evidence and commentary, and sophistication. And so the big one in the middle is evidence and commentary, for obvious reasons, because not only is it the meat of their essay, but also it's what they will be doing repeatedly. Right. And so you can get a point or no point for your thesis. Your thesis needs to, again, if you think back to those instructions that I looked at earlier, the thesis needs to present an interpretation and establish a line of reasoning. Right. So you're going to these 8 words are going to really be part of your students' vocabulary. Give them a little oration quiz. What does the thesis do? Present an interpretation and establish a line of reasoning, right? Like this is going to be the basis of everything that they do. So you can get a point for that. Then evidence and commentary, they're looking for well-developed commentary that explains the relationship, and that relationship is between the line of reasoning and the evidence. So, we have this problem sometimes with students who really they have found all the devices that they want to find. Here's a metaphor, and here's a simile, and here's an illusion, right? But they're looking to know that evidence that they're showing is matching that thesis that they've established, or the line of reasoning. And so those textual references are not only relevant, but I would say significant, in that they pull out what matters in answer to the prompt. And then that last point is going to be really this is going to be something that I think teachers will talk about for quite some time, especially between now and this first exam with this rubric, because sophistication is really hard to score and it's hard to teach, right? But it's thinking about not only the style and voice of the student, the craft of the essay, but also how sophisticated that line of reasoning is, how sophisticated their commentary is, whether or not. So on the old rubric, there was this idea of a persuasive analysis, right? Beyond reasonable, beyond plausible. And I think that's where also something that's going to play into sophistication is whether or not the student has identified something that was subtle in the text, or whether or not the student has identified something innovative, that, do they have a talent, really? I think sophistication is going to push into talent, which is going to, again, make it difficult to teach, but easy to point out. And so I think that's going to be something that's really going to push teachers to point out the way that published authors write and how they use that language, right, to craft their meaning, but also to craft their craft. So meta crafting. And so obviously, because this rubric is new, then the exemplars and the prompts, the student samples that they had, they were all on the holistic scoring guide. And so they're going to be putting out some new pieces in September. And so we'll wait and see what that looks like. But it's also going to be good practice just to take older essays, the older examples, and to score them on this new rubric and see if we were using this new rubric now, what would this get? It used to be an 8. What is it now? Is it a 5? Is it a 4? If we shift our understanding from the holistic idea of kind of good writing, strong writing, establishing analysis to these pieces, where does that essay fall? And so that's also something that's going to be coming up in a live stream. So we've got this rubric. To tell you the truth, I might miss that holistic guide. I think that it matches how I think. And so it's going to be both easier and tougher, I think, to score on this rubric. But to think about what are the benefits of this shift, like I said, it's going to be probably a little easier for students to understand where they are and what they need to work on. So obviously that's a benefit. It also will help in alignment, teacher to teacher. It will help teachers create their classes, right? Shift their units, adjust their units as students move through, because it's going to help them focus on remediation, reteaching of the things that students are struggling with. It's going to help them identify trends in a way that maybe the more holistic guide didn't do. So we'll see. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. So we'll see, and we'll also see if this shift does anything with scores. If it helps teachers support students toward higher scores. But just shifting from a 9 down to a 6 is going to be an adjustment. So you're actually more on the benefiting side if you've never taught AP Lit before, because you haven't been thinking about this. I know that our pre-AP teachers were using that holistic guide, so it's going to be something shifting for them too. So it might be the whole department shifting how they score things. It might be just the AP Lit teachers, AP Language teachers. But I think it's indicative of a shift maybe in teaching essay writing. So we'll see, how that goes. But think about how, right side, like what are the good things about having this kind of rubric as opposed to that kind of guide. So in the new course exam and description, the thing that they've done for the first time is actually present basically a scope and sequence with the units. The units are fleshed out. They tell you the genre that you're focusing on, and then they break down their big ideas and enduring understandings. So they really want you to know that it's not a curriculum, it's not a prescription, it's just an offering to support especially new teachers who are still figuring out, like, what might this look like for me, or how might this go? So there are 6 big ideas. And so these big ideas are the big ideas of most literature courses. They're just having students analyze function of character, function of setting, function of structure, function of narration, function of figurative language, and then how to create a literary argument. So those are the big ideas. And so these 6 will come in and out through units. We'll look at that in a moment. But they're the big ideas of the course, and thinking about how all these things function to, again, create meaning and create pleasure. So within the big ideas, they have enduring understandings. And so the enduring understandings are getting to the smaller pieces of all of those big ideas, thinking about how we analyze character in regard to their relationships, how we analyze character in regard to the things that they say and do, how we analyze setting, how we look at not only time and place, but the general environment, that sort of thing. And so those are the enduring understandings that fit into the big idea. And so then they have these core skills, and those are kind of the concrete pieces that a student would need in order to understand the enduring understandings and be able to analyze the big ideas. And so it's cool. I like it that it's written out that way for people who have been very standards-based in their pre-AP courses. I think that it's more strongly aligned to that sort of planning and teaching than it has been previously. There were, big ideas, but they weren't necessarily like structured this way. And so they weren't put into the units in the same way. And so for someone who was coming from, say, Common Core alignment, it was a little more difficult to say, okay, this is how this goes. And so they've broken it down to make it into units. So they have 9 units. And so pretty much, as you can see here, it goes in a cycle. It's going to be short fiction, poetry, long fiction, short fiction, poetry, long fiction, short fiction, poetry, long fiction, exam. The units are created. They have class periods. They have a number of class periods on them, and that is for like a 45-minute period. So if you're on a block schedule, whether that means you will have students every day for an hour and a half, or maybe every other day for an hour and a half, you can figure out how to kind of break that into what you need it to be, but it gives a class period. And then every unit ends with a progress check. So if you see here, and it makes sense when you think about it, the exam weights. And so this is basically how much these different pieces will show up on the exam. And so obviously long fiction is going to be the shortest because it's only addressed in that Q3, in that literary argument question. So poetry and short prose are going to be found not only in the free response, but also in the multiple choice. So it just makes sense, but also you need more time. So it's a whole unit and they're about the same length. They're like 17-ish class periods. So I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but you think about that cycle of basically Q2, Q1, Q3, Q2, Q1, Q3. And so when you teach AP Lit for a while, you do start to think about texts in terms of the questions, but that's okay, because so will the students, especially students who are more literal and structured. So these are the 9 units. This is the way that they go. And then now here, this is how those big ideas fall into the units. And so as you would imagine, right, they're repeated. This literary argumentation big idea is in every unit because they're going to create an argument in every unit. Now, what they do that is really kind of awesome that most people do, but might not think about, is start very small. And so unit 1, that's about short fiction, there's focus on having students create a paragraph at a time right? So not thinking necessarily that they're going to walk in and be able to defend a claim across an essay. And so I think that's a shift for teachers who maybe didn't feel as though it would be fair or that they would be able to scaffold students to that extent. And so I think it's 9 opportunities, 9 unit opportunities, which inside the unit you could have countless opportunities to create an argument, but thinking about how you build that, how you get higher and higher, right? How you increase the skills and increase the capacity in every unit. And so if you start with a paragraph, right, you might sit there for a while. You might sit at thesis for a while because you have to make sure that that thesis establishes a line of reasoning and introduces the interpretation. That right there could be almost a unit depending on where your students are coming in. So that's something to think about, but then also the rest of them. So structure also is in every unit. And so you're thinking about how structure matters. And so obviously in short fiction, the way that you are analyzing structure is different than the way that you're analyzing structure in poetry. And poetry might be more about form, whether you recognize the form, what the form does, what the line breaks do, that sort of thing. And so again, it's an opportunity to build and an opportunity to, when you're looking at this and when you're planning your course, to decide for you and your students how you're going to build and how the expectations will increase every time you hit one of these big ideas again. And so obviously it makes sense. Spiraling is something that we're accustomed to. We know that we start at one place and we're trying to get to another place, obviously. And so there are these progress checks also will increase in expectation. And so they might be shorter in the beginning and longer in the end. And so that's something that is a constant conversation among AP literature teachers. How much do I ask them to do? And then also, in what way do we grow? So if the essays they're allotted 40 minutes, do I give them 40 minutes in August or September and expect them to write only a thesis in that 40 minutes? Do I expect them to read, annotate, and write a thesis in 40 minutes? Or do I give them the assignment of an essay, but give them more than 40 minutes because maybe they're not accustomed to a timed writing? So that's something to think about. I usually am more of a supporter of same time growing expectation because I think that helps kind of stamp what 40 minutes feels like. And so if you're expecting more and more and more every time, then that's a little different than expecting the same thing in a shorter and shorter and shorter amount of time. But, you can decide, you can have kids decide, open it up to them and say, what works for you? Would you rather be writing full essays every unit, or would you rather grow an essay between now and late April, early May when you are finishing? So that's something to think about, but also just how these skills build. And of course, again, within these big ideas, there are these enduring understandings that also will help you scaffold and spiral. And so every time you come back, for example, if you're looking at setting, you look at it in short fiction, but then you don't look at it in poetry, you come back to it in long fiction, you're going to ask for more. So you're also thinking not only the difference between a short story and a novel, like how the setting continues to build and matter, but also I'm asking you to do the same thing that you did before, but here are the new enduring understandings or core skills that I'm adding. So again, I'm talking into the ether, but if you think about what's your favorite book, story, or poem to teach, I strongly suggest that you teach it. You figure out how to teach your favorite book, even if your favorite book is not something that is necessarily, of course, it's probably going to be of literary merit, but maybe it's something that's not necessarily usually taught at a college level. I think that you can't go too low. I think that there's a place for every book, story, or poem of literary merit. Because again, we're trying to have students constantly explore how authors use language to create not only meaning, but also pleasure, right? And so I have found that in AP Lit, the more excitement you have, the more excitement that they will have, because at the very least, they're going to be trying to understand why you're so excited. So one of my favorites is The Great Gatsby. I get so hung up on the language. Another one of my favorites is Beloved. which I think everybody should read in life. R.I.P. Toni Morrison, but also because it's so full of language, and that language is so powerful, and she has, she's just got such a skill. And so it's good to talk about sophistication. It's good to talk about structure and character. There's nothing there. All of those big ideas that we were looking at, they're all going to be in Beloved. And so usually it's my last book because I figure these are when you have the skills now. And so we've been building toward this, great masterpiece of a book that's also not too long, but very dense and very full. And so all of the skills that you've learned, we're going to practice here. So those are my favorites. Poems usually fall in line with one of those two books. And we'll talk about scheduling and sequencing in a moment. But if you think about that, you could make that the center of because in a lot of ways, AP Lit is a survey, but then it could also be a study. You could teach a Faulkner AP Lit or a Morrison AP Lit and just, think about how to scaffold the skills. It's all going to be up to you. And there are so few limitations because any book that you really have enjoyed teaching or really have enjoyed reading is probably going to fall into that literary merit bucket. And so you're going to be able to show students how to analyze. And then if it doesn't fall into that, canonical literary merit bucket, maybe you just still use it because it's still going to have some element, some of one of those big ideas that you can say, even in something that you couldn't necessarily write on the AP Lit exam, that you wouldn't necessarily read in a college course, we're still talking about character. We're still talking about narration, and let's lean in where you want to be so that you can understand how this applies. And so, for example, one thing that I really have enjoyed doing is reading Things Fall Apart, which I know is usually read earlier, but I read in 10th grade and college, I think. And so it definitely can be applied at various levels. And so if you say like, okay, so what did you do in 10th grade? 10th grade, you probably talked about culture, you talked about colonialism, but we're going to really lean into how he uses the culture as a character, how the setting impacts his Okonkwo's choices, right? How he interacts with other people, right? These are things that we can lean in, these big ideas, they apply everywhere. And I'm sure if you're a lit teacher and you're watching this, you're like, duh, I get this. But I think it's something to think about, especially if you are teaching students who are maybe not as prepared as you would expect in an AP Lit class. And so thinking about scaffolding not only those skills and those big ideas, but also the readings themselves. Because obviously there's a lot of literary merit to be found in novels that have been read earlier in their literature class experience. So start there. Whatever your favorite book is, whatever your favorite story is, your favorite poem, start there and think, how do I teach to these big ideas? And so then how do I do that again and again? So here are kind of three big ways to organize your class. And so one is by free response type or text genre, right? You teach short fiction, you teach poetry, you teach long fiction, and then you're probably going to teach a few, long fiction again. And that's pretty much the way that the College Board units are set up, right? So it's that cycle, short poetry, long, short poetry, long. But another way to do it is to dive into those big ideas, right? And then another way is to teach thematically. And so many teachers are a fan of each of these, right? They all have their kind of followings. But I just want to talk really quickly about kind of some pros and cons of each, and you'll see where my favorite lies. So the first is to set it up kind of the way the College Board has set it up, free response question type. And so then you could end each unit with that kind of free response practice. And so it's an easier way to get that direct instruction toward the essays. It's an easier way to set it up so that they're constantly thinking about the specific expectations of that particular essay. And so obviously that's a benefit. They're in that mode, right? And so even though those instructions are going to be on every essay, obviously there are specific expectations or specific needs for each particular essay. And that's why they have all three, right? So you can think about that. It's also a more direct alignment with the College Board course skills and the way that they need to write. And it's also easier if you keep coming back, if you're in that cycle, to spiral the skills and the expectations. And so again, think about, where do we start? What's the next level? What's the next step? What's the next step? What's the next step? So that you are both scaffolding and spiraling. Some not necessarily negatives, but limitations is that it could limit you on the kind of text that you're reading, right? You have to kind of stay in that bubble for your unit. And then also limits the implicit connections between texts. And so you say, if we're talking poetry, then it makes the connections between poems and the short stories a little more implicit. And so that's something that could be positive or negative, but it could be a limitation for students in terms of like thinking across genres and across ideas. If you teach by analysis element or devices, and what I mean by that is kind of the big ideas, those big ideas. If you say, we're going to have a unit here where we concentrate on character. And so I'm going to give you all these enduring understandings about character, all these, this progression of understandings about how we analyze character. And that's going to be in this unit. We're going to read 5 short stories, and in each of them, they're going to be strong characters. And so that's what we're going to analyze for. And then at the end, the progress check is going to be a character-based prose passage, right? Or even if you match stories and poems with a, say Catcher in the Rye, right? It's very, very character-driven. And so then you could give a Q3 at the end where you're talking about character, kind of focusing on some element of character, and that you've practiced building an argument, building a literary analysis argument about character through the unit. And so that makes the skill building of analysis, much more explicit. It's like, this is how we talk about this big idea. These are the words that you use. This is the vocabulary. These are the terms that are going to probably contribute to character. You're going to be talking more, you're going to be writing and analyzing dialogue more than you're analyzing setting, right? Maybe. This is the set of skills that you need in order to write about character. It's also a benefit of analyzing across genre. Like I said, you have stories and poems to support, right? Analyzing character. And then it's consistent practice in analyzing specifically to the prompt. So not thinking just generically those rubrics or those prompt instructions, but specifically when you come across a prompt about character, which the FRQ3 can be about character, is often about a character who, right, it exhibits this concept, but also question 2. Yes, question 2 is also often about relationships or characterization. And so you can analyze to those specifically. Some limitations is that, you and the students might get burned out on character. It's like, okay, I want to talk about, obviously you're writing about then discussing all of these elements and how they work together. But if you're focusing on one, you might be really ready for the unit. It also might be more difficult to select texts because you want to make sure that they are there are multiple ways to analyze that element. And then to an extent, that practice might be inauthentic because it's so focused on one device, and that they could see any element in Q1, 2, or 3. And so those are just things to think about. And the third way is to develop it thematically. So you can tell by the lack of limitations that I have here, this is something that I'm pretty fond of. I think, one, if you have a textbook or anthology, it's probably arranged by theme. It might be arranged by the big idea elements, but also that you are able to constantly talk about that meaning of work as a whole. And so that's something that they get accustomed to searching for. And it makes it easier to, some students, they want to know what they're looking for. And so if you've established this is thematically what we're discussing here, whether it's a poem, a short story, or kind of an anchor longer text, we're going to constantly be talking about justice, right? We're going to constantly be talking about hero's journey, kind of quest, identity. We're going to be constantly talking about coming of age, whatever it is. And whatever abstract concept you have thought of, there are at least 5 probably Q3s that are going to ask the students to analyze for that and interpret how that concept contributes to the meaning of the work as a whole. And so this is probably my favorite. I think usually what I do is some kind of a combination of all of them. I'm thinking thematically, and so I make a collection kind of texts that all hit that concept. But usually I have 1 or 2 big enduring big ideas that fall into those stuff. So, you know, the 2 elements, like, again, if it's Catcher in the Rye, maybe I'm thinking characterization. I'm going to hit setting a little bit because it matters. I'm going to hit language. I'm going to, but, you know, I would focus on, of those 6 big ideas, I would definitely focus on probably characterization, character and narration, right? And so those are going to fall inside of that big concept about identity. And then we'll be able to constantly discuss how those play into each other, how the way that a text is narrated impacts that theme, right? And that's going to constantly be Q3 preparation. So it's mostly thematic because that helps me support the text. And so whether it's short fiction or poetry or a long fiction unit, I'm going to try to find an abstract concept that creates a thread and ties it all together. And then at the end, we can talk about the way that it shows up in all of those texts. And so that's something, I think it's just the way that I think. I think it helps me because, again, those big ideas, they're going to constantly spiral, right? So we're going to come back to those and come back to those. And I would prefer that they spiral with the skills as opposed to diving into one for, 17 class periods or whatever the case may be. So this is definitely my favorite. I'm sure there are limitations, but I didn't really want to think about them because I just really feel like it hits most of what I'm trying to do in an AP Lit class. So I was going to just kind of leave it open for some dialogue, but I think, that's how I plan my course. I think about the abstract topics I'd like to dive into, and then also kind of what texts connect to that. I also try to have poetry thematically. So I've had poetry units that were kind of coming of age. And so we had some like childhood poems, and then we had some adolescence poems, and then we had some, adulthood poems, mostly adults looking back on their childhood or their adolescence. And just thinking about how poetry, how language can be used to express those complex ideas on the journey through life. And so even things like that. I will say that my first unit is usually a boot camp, and that is less thematic usually. I have made it thematic, but usually it's about introducing those big ideas. And so I have 1 or 2 stories per big idea. And so it's like, again, so here's, boot camp, right? So this is the way that we're going to talk about character. We're going to get back into it, but these are the basics. Whatever you didn't catch in 9 through 11 or 5 through 11, right? Because AP Lit was 12th grade. Whatever you didn't catch, here it is. Like, here's the way we talk about it. Here's the way we look at it, and have notes, right? It's far more lecture than any other unit, hopefully, so that you have a basis. So, when we come back to a big idea, then you were saying, how do we talk about this? Like, what are the words that we're trying to use? Side story, I went to a college math class as a teacher. When I was teaching Lit, I went to a college math class on a field trip, and a teacher, the professor, was saying, okay, now after the students had answered the question or were trying to work the problem, she said, okay, now say that to me in math. And so I always think about that. And so it's tough in English because, you know, we're already speaking in English, but sometimes I do say, okay, now what is that? How do you say that in lit? You know, like how do we kind of frame that? And I think that's a push towards sophistication as well. So that's just kind of my big overview for new teachers of AP Lit. I hope that everyone has gotten something, everyone who's watched it has gotten something from it, has sparked a thought, whether you are creating this class for the first time or the 31st time, that you've thought about something and kind of started to wrap your head around there are differences. You know, I think that they're not as, they're more subtle than some of the differences or changes that other courses have made, but there's a shift, right, in some of the thinking that has to happen. And so I hope that I've sparked a little thought in terms of how you might think about that, or how your students might think about it. And if not, I've had a good time talking about it. So thank you and good night.